If you were standing here on 24th of July 1411, you would have had a front row seat to one of Scotland's largest ever clan battles, if not the largest ever clan battle fought on Scottish soil. Now, it was a battle between Donald of Islay, Lord of the Isles, against Alexander Stewart, the Earl of Mar. Donald commanded an army of 10,000 Highlanders from the western regions of Scotland and the Isles. Alexander Stewart commanded a lowland army levied from men in the northeastern parts of Scotland, which was estimated to be around 1,500 to 2,000 men. Now, this battle was part of a larger power play, and it was over the dispute of land, particularly the Earldom of Ross, which was a large swathe of land in the northwestern region of Scotland. Now, we'll get into that in a little bit, but this battle was known as Red Harlaw. Now, it was known as Red Harlaw because the moorland it was fought on was soaked in blood for many days after the battle, because it was an extremely fierce battle, and the soldiers weren't only dying from each other's swords and spears, they were dying from exhaustion and dehydration due to how long the battle was fought over the course of the day, and due to the extreme heat apparently on the day also, which was fought in July, so it would have been summer. This was Red Harlaw. This was the Battle of Harlaw. Now, in the aftermath of this battle, it would accelerate the already growing cultural divide between the Norse Gaelic Highlands and the Norman Saxon Lowlands. Now, this was a battle not between Gaels and Lowlands, because there's a lot less difference between the Highlands and the Lowlands than people think. You know, it wasn't totally different worlds. They're quite similar. This area is here. Many people would have spoke Gaelic. It was, you know, a lot of it was to do with propaganda. A lot of propaganda was pumped into this divide. The Gaels, you know, the Cateran, these barbarians in the north. But the truth is, they weren't that different from the people here in the northeast of Scotland. Now, the dispute over the Earldom of Ross was between Donald of Islay, the Lord of the Isles, and the Duke of Albany, who was an Albany Stewart. He was King Regent of Scotland at the time because Scotland's current king, who was an adolescent, King James I, he was in captivity in England. So during this time, the Duke of Albany had been increasing his power in Scotland and increasing all his earldoms. And by the time of the battle of the 14 major earldoms in Scotland, the Duke of Albany had control of 6 of them via himself and his children. Now, that's quite a lot of land, and it was estimated to be around 43% of Scotland's land at the time. Now, Donald had a claim to the Earldom of Ross, and so did the Duke of Albany. So the reason this dispute happened is because the Earl of Ross, Alexander Leslie, he had died. Now, his wife and himself, they had given birth to a girl called Euphemia II. Now, Euphemia, she was the granddaughter of the Duke of Albany. And Alexander Leslie's sister, she was married to Donald of the Isles. So Euphemia's aunt was Donald of the Isles' wife, and her step-uncle was Donald of the Isles. So they both had a claim through this connection. Now, Euphemia apparently had some sort of physical or mental impairment. It's not documented too well, but there's definitely some impairment of some sort. Now, Donald and the Duke of Albany, they both agreed that she was unfit to bear the title of the Earl of Ross. So this is where the dispute began. Now, what happens is, essentially, the Duke of Albany, he claims the Earldom of Ross as his. Now, this really doesn't sit well with Donald, and in the year 1410 and the years before it, he had already started to do some raids into the Earl of Ross, essentially flexing his muscles and turned his nose up to the Duke of Albany, who had control of this region. Now, in 1411, Donald of the Isles marched towards Dingwall, which was the seat of power in the Earldom of Ross at the time. Now, the clans in this army were all the septs of Clan Donald, MacLeans of Stewart, MacLeans of Lochbuie, MacLeods of Harris, MacLeods of Lewis and Dunvegan, Lamonts, MacLaughlins, Macintoshes. This was a massive clan party that headed towards Dingwall Castle, which was the seat of power of the Earldom of Ross. Now, a man called Angus Dhu Mackay, he commanded a force of 2,500 clansmen, consisting of Mackays, Frasers, Mackenzies, Dingwalls and Munros. So they assembled to march south to face Donald at the battle, which was known as the Battle of Dingwall. Now, after that battle, Angus Dhu Mackay's forces were defeated and he was actually captured by Donald of the Isles. Donald then marched towards Inverness and lay waste to the town of Inverness, famously burning down the Oak Bridge in Inverness. Now, apparently the sacking of this town was very severe and there's records of it being burned completely. Now, after the burning of Inverness, Donald marched his 10,000 strong army eastwards towards this area here, and he actually encamped all his troops at the slopes of Benihee. Just at my right shoulder here, you can see it. It's got a little point in the mountain and a little factory. There's actually used to be an ancient Pictish kingdom fort on top of that slope. So it was a good position to camp out your men, especially a host of 10,000 men. Now, Donald's army, they were very mobile. It's not, if you can imagine the army, it wasn't like a long military train going from Inverness to Aberdeen. The forces would have been really spread out across the land, because Highland armies, they were at this time, they weren't used to being coming together, you know, like a Norman Saxon Lowland force. They were more mobile forces fighting in smaller groups. So they would have just descended upon this region here in a vast spread, not in any real formation. So they camped at the slopes of Benihee here. Now, apparently Donald's army, they didn't expect to be met with much resistance coming here on their path towards Aberdeen. They really expected it just to be a walkover. But Alexander Stewart and the Earl of Mar, he had met with his nobles at Kildrummy Castle the winter before in December of 1410. So this is prior to the sacking of Dingwall and Inverness, because there had been a good amount of raids in the Earldom of Ross in the summer of 1410 and the months before it. So they had really, Alexander Stewart, him and amongst his nobles, they had realised there was a threat, there was dark clouds brewing over the western part of Scotland. So they gathered at Kildrummy to come together and feast, obviously for Christmas, but the main purpose of the meeting was to come together and get a plan of what they would do if Donald of the Isles marched his army north and then maybe northeastwards towards their lands. And it was agreed that Alexander Stewart, the Earl of Mar, he would be the commander of this army, because it required aggressiveness and they had no intention of being defensive and waiting for this horde to come and attack them. That was absolutely unthinkable. So they looked to Alexander the Stewart for aggressive leadership, and that's exactly what they got. So the plan would be, if there was any invasion, Alexander Stewart, the Earl of Mar, he would lead an army mustered from northeastern Scotland against Donald. So Alexander Stewart, the Earl of Mar, he had mustered his men at Inverurie between the River Don and the River Uri, and he was gathering his forces. Now, he had received word on the 23rd of July that Donald had encamped his men beneath the slopes of Benihee, just behind me here. And the intelligence he received was that the army wasn't actually, apparently not aware of the Earl of Mar's forces. Now, using this information, the Earl of Mar actually took the initiative and decided to attack Donald of the Isles. So you see, in this battle he had only two advantages really. One was this element of surprise, and the second was that his force was much more armoured than in comparison to Donald of the Isles' army, because the Lowland force, they had much superior armour, and many of the nobility had some of the finest armour in Europe at the time, and there are accounts of this, and I'll leave the sources that I get this information from in the link in the video. So this armour that the Lowland army had, it was much superior to Donald's army, but not all the forces in the army would have had it. Not all the men. You know that a lot of the lower ranks, they still would have been they would have had superior armour compared to Donald's army, but it wouldn't have been, the armour wouldn't have been as obviously nice and as effective as, you know, the higher nobility in this army of the Earl of Mar. So the Earl of Mar marches his army out from Inverurie. Now the distance between Inverurie, which is in the south behind you here, and the north is around, just to the slopes of Benahee, it's around 2-3 miles. So there wasn't actually a lot of distance between the two armies. Alexander Stewart, he moved quickly to attack Donald. Now he would have came onto this field here, and Donald's army would have been spread out along the encampment, along Benahee and the fields here. Now, if you can just put yourself in the shoes of these lowland soldiers coming up the hill, and you just see a sea of camps in steel and shield and army. Now, you have to put yourself in their shoes. How would you have felt seeing this? You would have been pretty scared, to say the least. So they were marching up towards Donald of the Isles' army in tightly packed schiltrons, which was hedgehog formations of spears, very tightly compact to increase effectiveness against armies, superior armies attacking them, as they wouldn't be able to break in. Now, upon seeing this, Donald wasn't prepared for this force. He really didn't expect any resistance from this part of Scotland. And there's also accounts of his army actually being out foraging for food in the nearby fields and lands. So upon seeing this army coming up towards him, the fields here coming up towards him, the slopes of Benahee, he quickly mustered his forces and prepared to attack and meet this army. Now there's accounts of the battle from people who fought in the battle, and again I'll leave these sources in the links below, of Donald's army coming out from beneath the slopes of Benahee and the fields around here towards the Earl of Mar's army, and it was described as being like an avalanche of shields and steel, with the steel glittering from the sun and the sky coming towards them. Now that must have been absolutely terrifying, because these Highlanders and Islandsmen, that have been hollering and screaming coming towards this army that was quite famous of, you know, that like the early days of the Highland charge, you know, the Elan, they were being charging towards this army. The two armies met, and upon impact, you know, a lot of this is taken from accounts of what we know happened. There was so much dust around the field coming up with the two armies met, so it would have been really hard to see. A lot of these armies, you know, they had helmets and halberds. You wouldn't have had much visibility. And of course, it's noted as well that the battle, the field of the battle, was the smell of urine and excrement and blood was just apparently filling the air, along with the dust and everything rising up. You can imagine it just would have been absolutely chaotic. Now, upon the collision, the Highlanders of Donald of the Isles' army, they actually pushed back the army around it's reported to be around 3 to 4 acres back across these fields here, and it was only around about 2-3 acres after they got pushed back that they managed to actually hold their ground. The men of the Earl of Mar, they managed to, you know, gain a bit of a foothold. Now, in this army that the Earl of Mar had, which consisted of 2,500 to 1,500 men, around about there, they had a small contingent of cavalry. Now that cavalry was apparently used at this point when they were being pushed back to try and relieve that assault and try and let their troops, the soldiers, to kind of gain a foothold. Now it's reported that these cavalry went in to the right flank of the Donald of the Isles army, which was actually commanded by Red Hector MacLean. He was one of Donald's highest ranking commanders of this army, in addition to the left flank of his army, which was commanded by Malcolm Mackintosh. So this cavalry force from the Earl of Mar crashes into the side of Donald's right flank, and apparently it wasn't as effective as the Earl of Mar had hoped, because the horses came in, but just due to the sheer number of Highlanders, they were just, a lot of these men were dragged from their horses and stabbed continuously until they were dead. So now the Earl of Mar had a foothold with his men in this field, and then the battle just became a bit of a grind between the two forces. Now, over the course of the battle, which, mind you, it last started in the morning and it lasted the entire day, which would have been a day like this, you know, this is July, so the actual battle only took place last week. So if I was standing here a week ago, I would have been overlooking this battle taking place. Now, mind you, I wouldn't have been anywhere near this battle. I would have been running for the hills. But a lot of these soldiers, they didn't have a choice. They had to face off. And the Earl of Mar, he led from the front. He was in the vanguard. So then the battle was continuing to take place over the course of the day. Just put yourself in the shoes of these soldiers from both sides, because they were both humans. They both would have been absolutely exhausted. Of course, they're getting cut from shields and swords coming in to the spears. If you're the Earl of Mar's side, the soldiers on that side, you're holding your spears, keep your formation tight, and you've got these wild Islesmen and Highlanders charging towards you, flinging themselves onto your spears, which was noted to have happened because they were extremely brave and courageous. Now, the battlefield was just starting to pile up of dead bodies, so you can imagine the smell of all what that would entail. And it's also noted that many of these soldiers, they died from exhaustion and dehydration, because you couldn't exactly just nip out from the front and go have a wee quick bit of water and come back in. You were at the front, you were in the front line. I mean, the adrenaline pumping through your body must have been absolutely insane. You would have been in the heat of the battle, so you would have just kept going. You wouldn't have thought about anything else. You're thinking of survival against these Islanders and Islesmen charging towards you and trying to, you know, kill you. Now, over the course of the day, the battle is continuing to last. Imagine the whole day slogging away. It just came to a bit of a grind. Now, the battle raged on throughout the entire day, and it just continued to be an absolute bloody battle, and it was only relieved. The battle was only stopped at the cover of darkness, where both sides separated for the day. During the battle, there was a famous duel between two prominent warriors from each side, Red Hector MacLean and Sir Alexander of Drum. Now, apparently during the battle, these two came together in an individual duel, and apparently the duel was of epic proportions, because these two men, they were known to be big and strong warriors, so that the coming of these two soldiers, it would have been noticed on the field of battle. And apparently neither man could apply a decisive blow to the other, and they both actually died, either be to exhaustion or dehydration, or just the wounds they inflicted on each other. So that was a notable moment from this battle. Now, as the day went on, darkness started to set in, and then the forces started to break off. So this was kind of, you know, the end of the battle for the day. Now, the casualties that had been inflicted on Donald of the Isles' army is estimated to be around 1,000 men of his 10,000 force, so it's around 10% of his men. In contrast to the Earl of Mar's, it's estimated to be around 600 men fell, so there was less men, but they had a much smaller army of, it's estimated to be around only 2,000 men. So if you started with 2,000 and you've lost 600, you've only got around 1,400 men left. Nearly the amount that MacDonald of the Isles' army has lost. So when Donald of the Isles' army withdrew from the battlefield for the day, the Earl of Mar's army, they actually slept on the field here in their armour, more than prepared to fight the next day, because they had seen the vastness of Donald's army. They knew they were outnumbered, so they must have known that they were going to die the next day. And I mean, you can just imagine that night, sleeping, thinking that the next day, this night's probably going to be your last, because you can't defeat that army. That is an enormous army. you can hold them off and maybe cut some of them down, 2 or 3 to every man you have, but then you're still, it's not going to be enough. So that night, they must have been thinking, this is it. This is the end. So then, upon first light, the Earl of Mar's bewildered army comes onto the field to expect Donald of the Isles' army to prepare to go again, essentially, maybe to finish them off. But to their amazement, they look out to the field and there's nobody there. Donald of the Isles' army had withdrew, and he'd taken his army not back to Inverness or Dingwall, he'd taken his army all the way back to Ardtornish and Islay, where he originally had set off. Now, Aberdeen was saved. This was a miracle, if you believe in those things, but many of these men would not have believed their luck, because they were fully expecting to come onto this field of battle and die, because they had no reason to think otherwise, because why would an army so large in comparison to theirs want to leave? Well, there was a number of reasons why. We can speculate as to why Donald of the Isles maybe would have withdrew his army. One was the death of Red Hector MacLean, which was one of his highest commanders, and the other of Malcolm Mackintosh, who was commanding his left wing. He had lost 2 important commanders in his army, and we don't know exactly why he withdrew. I mean, I've read, and this is really for you to decide who you think won this battle, because Donald of the Isles, if he really wanted to, he could have destroyed this army, if he really wanted to, but he withdrew with superior numbers. Now, I've read some books and research on this, and some people have deemed it Clan Donald's greatest defeat, as in attributing a defeat to the Highlanders, because, symbolically, usually in battles, leaving the field of battle, especially back in this time, it was symbolic of a losing side to leave the field of battle. So the Earl of Mar and his men, he had held the field of battle, so they had claimed it as a victory. But also, through what we know from accounts from Gaelic bards and stories, Donald of the Isles' army, they claimed it as a victory as well. So you have both sides claiming it as a victory. Now, who won it, or who do you think won this side or that side? I'll leave that up to you. So let me know in the comment section what you think, who you think won this battle, because it is an interesting discussion, and I've had a few discussions with people who are quite knowledgeable in this battle, and it is still a question back and forth. Or did Donald win? Did Earl of Mar win? But anyway, the battle's over, so then Donald of the Isles actually relinquished his claim to the earldom. So then the Duke of Albany, he then became, or he was already the Earl of Ross, but he then retained the title that he took from his granddaughter Euphemia. Now after this, the Earl of Mar, he was actually wounded in the battle, and it's also important to highlight that many nobles fell in this battle from in the Lowland army. Sir Alexander of Drum, he died. The Lord Provost of Aberdeen, he died. The Sheriff of Angus, Ogilvy, he had died also. So it was actually quite one of those Scottish battles that it was really made up of so much nobility, and it was actually, more than most battles had seen at the time with regards to how much nobility was in this force. So as a result of this battle, Donald of the Isles, so he had to relinquish his claim to the Earldom of Ross. So then the Duke of Albany, he then solidified his control over the Earldom of Ross. But funnily enough, a few years later, when the King of Scotland, King James I, when he came out of captivity from England and came back to Scotland, Donald, Lord of the Isles, he was actually issued with the Earldom of Ross. So I mean, he got it anyway. So it's kind of like, well, maybe if he was just a bit more patient, he might have just waited and got it. But obviously things were different at the time. He really felt that he had a rightful claim to this earldom. As did the Duke of Albany. He'd obviously been gathering all these earldoms in Scotland, and he thought the Earldom of Ross would make a nice addition to his collection of already grown earldoms. But this battle, you know, it's a monumental battle, and it's one it's not remembered enough in Scottish history, and that's why I wanted to do this video today, just to try and go over some points and hopefully, you know, highlight some facts that had been missing before, or you maybe have not known, because it's an absolutely fascinating battle, and it really interested me. And I've actually got a link to a good book on the battle that I'll leave down in the description of the video if you are interested. So if you did enjoy that video, folks, then please leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm, and because those are the ones that help the video grow. So if you want to support me, that's a great way you could do it. And also leave a like as well if you did enjoy the video. I would really appreciate that. So folks, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.